Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive from the All Sorts podcast.
Glad to be here again.
So today we're gonna be talking about the T-34 Soviet medium tank.
Yes.
And its role in World War II, but also its long history after the war.
Absolutely.
So to tackle this, we've got a few different sources. First, we have Osprey's book, T-34-85 medium tank, 1944-94.
Uh-huh.
We also have Tankograd's Panzerkampfwagen T-34-747R.
Right.
Which, that one looks at captured T-34s in German service.
It's just in respect.
We also have the Armorama Illustrated History.
Okay.
And, of course, the Wikipedia article on the T-34.
Of course. Always a good resource.
Yeah. I think our goal today is to really understand, I guess, like how revolutionary the T-34 was.
Yeah.
When it first appeared, its impact on the Eastern Front and how it evolved into the T-34-85, and then even its surprising longevity afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those tanks you think of when you think of the entire 20th century.
Yeah, it's pretty ubiquitous.
Yeah.
So let's start with where it all began. The T-34 didn't just, like, appear out of nowhere, right?
No, definitely not. So it was really born out of necessity in the late 1930s. The Red Army, they realized that their BT series of tanks were becoming outdated.
Yeah.
So they needed a more modern design. And this led to the creation of a design team at the Kharkiv Comintern Locomotive Plant, or KHPZ for short.
Okay.
And it was led by this really talented engineer named Mikhail Koshkin.
So this is where, like, the early prototypes came from.
That's right. One of the early prototypes was called the A-20.
Okay.
And it had a new engine, relatively light armor at just 20 millimeters, and a convertible wheel and track system.
Wheels and tracks.
Yeah. So it could run on either wheels or tracks.
That's kind of wild.
Yeah, it was an interesting concept.
But I guess they eventually went away from that idea, right?
They did.
Yeah.
You see, the convertible drive, it offered higher road speeds, up to 85 kilometers per hour potentially. And it could reduce wear and tear on the tracks during long road marches.
Yeah.
But it ended up being a very complicated system. By that time, track technology had actually improved quite a bit.
Okay.
So the designers just decided that the complexity and the weight of the convertible system,
Yeah.
it wasn't worth the limited benefit. Especially given, the demands of combat.
That makes sense. So they focused on tracks, but also kept that sloped armor idea.
Exactly. And that really became one of the T-34's defining features.
Yeah. So what did the T-34 look like when it first went into production? Like, what were the key features?
Well, the initial model, which the Germans later designated the T-34-76,
Okay.
it had a powerful 76.2 millimeter gun.
Mm-hmm.
But the really revolutionary thing was the 60-degree sloped armor on the front hull and the turret.
And that was a big deal because...
It massively increased the effective thickness of the armor
Okay.
and the chances of deflecting enemy rounds.
Yeah.
It offered a level of protection that really hadn't been seen before in a tank of its class.
Wow.
It wasn't just tougher steel. The whole design philosophy was different. It balanced mobility and protection in a way that nobody expected.
So, were there any problems with the early production models?
Oh, there are definitely some challenges. First off, manufacturing that heavier sloped armor.
Yeah.
It proved difficult at first. There were a lot of defective armor plates.
Oh, wow.
And then communication was a huge issue. Radios were incredibly scarce.
So how did they communicate?
Well, only the company commander's tank would usually have a radio.
Okay.
The rest of the tanks had to rely on visual signals, like flags.
Flags.
Yeah, flags, not exactly the most efficient way to communicate in the heat of battle.
No.
And they also had some problems with the L-11 gun. It wasn't quite as good as they had hoped.
Right. It seems like there are always some kinks to work out with new technology, especially in wartime.
Oh, absolutely.
So, how did they address these problems?
Well, first off, the gun.
Yeah.
The Graben Design Bureau at Gorky Factory M.92 developed the 76.2 millimeter F-34 gun, and it was much more effective.
But they didn't immediately switch over to that gun, right?
No, it took some convincing bureaucracy. Those things can really slow things down.
Yeah.
But once the troops on the front lines started giving feedback on how much better the F-34 was,
Yeah.
the State Defense Committee finally approved it for widespread production.
So the battlefield experience won out over the paperwork in the end.
That's right.
Okay, so we had the initial model, 1940, but what came after that?
Well, the Model 1940, there were only about 400 of those made.
Okay.
And then came the Model 1941.
Okay.
This model incorporated the F-34 gun, a much better radio set called the 9RS.
Okay.
And thicker armor in some places.
Got it. It's amazing to think about how much production must have been going on to equip the Soviet army.
Oh, it was massive. It was a huge distributed effort.
So where were all the different parts being made?
Okay, so the V-234 diesel engine came from the Kharkiv diesel factory N.75. The guns were made at the Leningrad Kirovsky factory. The electrical components came from the Dynamo factory in Moscow.
Okay.
And the initial assembly mostly took place at plant N.183. But later on, the Stalingrad tractor factory and the Krasnoye Sormovo factory N.112 also joined in the assembly effort.
So basically, factories all across the Soviet Union were contributing to this.
Yeah, it was a nationwide effort.
And I've heard that they actually got much more efficient at producing T-34s as the war went on. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
How did they do that?
They constantly refined and streamlined their production methods.
Okay.
And this really helped bring down the cost.
By how much?
It went from 269,500 rubles in 1941 to just 135,000 rubles by the end of the war.
Wow. That's a pretty huge difference.
Yeah, it was crucial.
Yeah.
Because it meant they could keep churning out tanks despite taking heavy losses.
Yeah.
And having a low production cost like that wasn't just good for the economy. It meant they could overwhelm the Germans with sheer numbers, which was a core part of their military strategy. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And those losses were definitely massive. Just how many T-34s were actually produced?
Over 57,300
Wow.
by the end of World War II in 1945.
So it really was the backbone of their armored forces.
It really was. At the start of the war in 1941, T-34s only made up about 4% of Soviet tanks.
Okay.
But by the end, they were producing at least 55% of all their tanks.
That's a massive shift. And it wasn't just about the numbers either, right?
That's right. The T-34, it actually influenced Soviet military doctrine.
How so?
Well, its speed and its firepower made it perfect for their deep battle strategy.
And what was that?
Well, deep battle was all about rapid multi-echelon offensives.
Okay.
Designed to break through enemy lines and exploit the operational depth of their defenses.
I see. So it sounds like the T-34 was in a class of its own.
Yeah.
What were the main tanks that it was up against? Okay, so the T-34 and the American M4 Sherman, they were the main medium tanks for the Allies.
Right.
Both of them were, continually upgraded throughout the war.
Yeah.
The early T-34, it was comparable in some ways to the German Panzer IV.
Okay.
That was Germany's most numerous tank.
Yeah.
But each one had its own strengths and weaknesses. But it's important to note that neither the T-34 nor the Sherman could really match up to the heavier German tanks.
All right.
Like the Panther or the Tiger there.
Yeah.
So the Soviets developed the IS-2 heavy tank to counter them.
Mm-hmm.
And the Americans had the M26 Pershing.
Okay.
Yeah. But there's something else really interesting about the T-34. Its sloped armor. It really caught the Germans off guard.
Yeah.
Because neither the early Sherman nor the Panzer IV had that to the same degree.
So when did the T-34 first encounter German forces in battle?
That was in the summer of 1941.
And how did the Germans react to it?
They were shocked, really. The T-34's heavy sloped armor was practically immune to their standard anti-tank weapons.
Yeah, I've heard stories about how ineffective their guns were against it.
Well, there are some pretty unbelievable anecdotes from that time. The 37mm PaK-36 anti-tank gun.
Yeah.
That was the main anti-tank weapon for the German infantry.
Mm-hmm.
It was so useless against the T-34 that they nicknamed it the tank door knocker.
The tank door knocker.
Yeah. There were even cases where German gun crews would fire like 20 rounds at close range into a T-34.
Mm-hmm.
And all they would manage to do was like jam the turret ring.
Seriously?
Yeah, they couldn't penetrate the armor.
That's insane. What about their tank guns? Were those any better?
Even their 50mm gun, according to a journal report in 1942,
Yeah.
it was only really effective against the sides or the rear of the T-34.
Okay.
And even then, they needed a perpendicular hit.
Wow.
But to be fair, Soviet reports from the early part of the war, they do say that the 37mm PaK-36 could penetrate the front.
Oh.
But only at extremely close range.
Like how close?
300 to 400 meters?
Okay, so basically point-blank range.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
But the real game changer came when the Germans started deploying more powerful anti-tank weapons.
Like what?
Like the 7.5cm PaK-40 and the 88mm guns.
Right.
Those could do some serious damage.
So the Germans eventually caught up, and they also started improving their own tanks, right?
Oh,
They realized that the T-34 was a real threat.
They did. They started upgrading their Panzer IV tanks with the longer 7.5 centimeter KWK-40 gun.
And that made a big difference.
Oh, yeah. It made the Panzer V much more dangerous to the T-34-76.
It's like a constant arms race.
It really was.
Yeah.
You know, one side would develop something, and then the other side would have to counter it.
Right. Were there any other, tactical differences that were noticed in those early battles?
Yeah, German reports often mention that the T-34 was pretty slow at acquiring and engaging targets.
Oh.
Compared to their own tanks.
Okay.
They said they could often fire 3 rounds for every 1 shot from a T-34. And the 76 millimeter gun on the early T-34s, it really struggled against the frontal armor of the German heavy tanks.
Like the Tiger Eye and the Panther?
Exactly.
So what did they do?
Well, the Soviet tankers, they often had to try and flank the German tanks.
Okay.
Or use special tungsten core ammunition.
Which was probably in short supply, I imagine?
Yeah, it wasn't always easy to come by.
Yeah.
So you can see why they eventually had to upgrade the T-34.
And that's where the T-34-85 comes in.
Right.
So what was the main reason for the upgrade?
They needed more firepower.
Okay.
To deal with those heavier German tanks.
Now, I know that they actually tried to create a completely new tank, the T-43.
Yeah, the T-43.
Why didn't that end up replacing the T-34?
Well, the T-43 was meant to be a universal tank.
Okay.
With heavier armor.
Mm-hmm.
It was supposed to replace both the T-34 and the KV-1 heavy tank.
Ambitious.
Yeah.
So what happened?
It just wasn't good enough. The armor, even though it was thicker than the T-34, it still couldn't reliably stop the German 88 millimeter guns.
Okay.
And its mobility wasn't as good as the T-34. Plus, switching production over to a completely new tank.
Yeah.
That would slow things down significantly.
Right, which they couldn't afford to do in the middle of the war.
Exactly. So they just decided to upgrade the existing T-34 instead.
Makes sense. So how did they decide on the 85 millimeter gun?
They did some firing tests in 1943 against captured Tiger Eye tanks.
Okay.
And they found that the 76 millimeter gun just couldn't penetrate the frontal armor.
Yeah.
But they had this 85 millimeter anti-aircraft gun, the M1939.
Okay.
And that actually had enough firepower to do the job.
Interesting. So they adapted an anti-aircraft gun for use on a tank.
Yeah, they developed tank-mounted versions of it.
Wow. And the new gun wasn't the only major change, was it? The T-34-85 had a new turret, too.
Yeah, one of the most important changes was the bigger turret ring.
Okay.
Which allowed them to install a 3-man turret.
Ah, so now you have the commander, the gunner, and the loader.
Exactly.
So that must have made a huge difference.
It did. Before, the commander had to either load the gun or aim it, which meant they couldn't fully focus on commanding the tank.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But with the 3-man turret, the commander was finally free to, actually command.
Lead the tank, coordinate with others.
Precisely. It was much more efficient. In fact, the Red Army was the last major European army to adopt this 3-man turret setup.
Really?
Yeah, the Germans had been using it since their early Panzer III models.
Interesting. So in the T-34-85, the commander had their own dedicated cupola.
That's right. With all-around vision and a periscopic sight. Much better for battlefield awareness. The early ones had split hatches, but later on they switched to a more practical one-piece hatch.
Okay.
And another big change was moving the radio from the hull to the turret.
Right, so it's closer to the commander.
Yeah.
Made communication easier.
Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there were actually 2 different 85 millimeter guns used in the T-34-85.
Yeah, that's right.
What were they?
So the initial model, 1944, used the D5T gun.
Okay.
And then later models used the ZSS-53, which was simpler and cheaper to produce.
I see.
They also had to redesign the gun mantlet to fit the bigger gun.
So mantlet, that's the armored cover around the gun, right?
Yeah, and they had to reposition the telescopic sight, too.
Okay. So the T-34-85, it was a much more powerful tank, but also bigger and heavier, right?
That's right.
Weren't there any downsides to that?
Well, the turret did have more armor, up to 90 millimeters.
Okay.
But it was a bigger target overall, and the slope wasn't as steep.
Yeah.
And the 85 millimeter shells, even though they were much better at penetrating armor, they were heavier.
Okay.
So they could only carry between 55 and 60 rounds.
Compared to the earlier models, which could carry more of the smaller 76 millimeter rounds.
Exactly. So there were trade-offs.
Right. But ultimately, it sounds like the T-34-85 was a very successful upgrade.
Oh, yeah. It was a huge improvement. It became the standard Soviet medium tank for the rest of the war.
I see. So, how did it stack up against the German tanks at that point?
Okay, so it still couldn't match the Panther or the Tiger in terms of armor or raw firepower.
Right.
But the 85 millimeter gun made it a lot more effective against a wider range of German tanks.
Okay.
And it still had its mobility advantage over the Panzer IV and the Stug third assault gun.
Because of its wider tracks.
Exactly. Those wider tracks were perfect for the terrain on the Eastern Front.
Hmm.
And strategically, the Soviets focused on mass-producing the T-34-85, which was relatively cost-effective.
Hmm.
While the Germans, they were focusing on developing fewer but more complex and heavier tanks.
Okay.
And that really played into the Soviets' hands. They ended up with a huge numerical advantage in tanks.
Yeah.
I mean, they produced over 22,500 T-34-85s.
Wow.
Compared to the much smaller numbers of Panthers and Tigers.
And the production costs went down too, right?
They did. By 1945, the T-34-85 was actually cheaper to make than the earlier model 1943.
So it sounds like they really perfected their production process.
They really did.
Now, we've talked a lot about the firepower and the armor, but how reliable was the T-34 mechanically?
Well, its wide tracks and Christie suspension gave it incredible cross-country performance.
Okay.
Especially on that muddy, uneven terrain of the Eastern Front. But in the early days, it did have some serious mechanical problems.
Oh!
Yeah, it could be really unreliable.
In what way?
Well, long road marches were a nightmare.
Okay.
In June 1941, during the German invasion,
Yeah.
the Soviet 8th Mechanized Corps lost about half their vehicles just from breakdowns during a 500-kilometer road march.
That's unbelievable. What was causing all those breakdowns?
A lot of it was down to problems with the clutches and transmissions.
Okay.
They were prone to failure. Some crews even carried spare transmissions with them just in case.
Wow.
And the original air filter, the Pomon, it was terrible.
What was wrong with it?
It couldn't filter out the dust and sand on the Eastern Front.
Okay.
So all that abrasive stuff would get into the engine and cause problems.
Right.
Eventually, they replaced it with the Cyclone and the multi-cyclone filters, which were much better.
I see. It's amazing how a seemingly small detail like an air filter can have such a huge impact.
Oh, yeah. In those conditions, every little detail matters.
It's interesting to consider what the Germans thought about the T-34's reliability after they captured some.
Yeah, well, the Germans called captured T-34s Butpanzer.
Okay.
And their reports often said that the T-34 wasn't really suitable for long or high-speed marches.
Because?
They said it needed frequent stops for the engine to cool down.
Interesting.
The Soviets actually did their own factory trials throughout the war.
Okay.
And they showed that the percentage of T-34s that could complete a certain distance without breaking down,
Sure.
it gradually improved.
So they were clearly working on those reliability issues.
Yeah, they were always trying to make it better.
So the T-34 story doesn't end with World War II, right?
No, not at all. It
Yeah.
had a really long service life.
It's kind of crazy to think about how long it was used for.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It became almost ubiquitous.
So where was it deployed after the war?
Well, they kept producing it in the Soviet Union,
Mm-hmm.
and they even licensed production to Poland and Czechoslovakia in the 1950s.
Okay.
So it became a standard tank for all the Warsaw Pact countries.
Right.
And for a lot of other Soviet-aligned countries around the world.
So it was almost like a symbol of Soviet influence.
Yeah, it really was. And it saw action in a lot of conflicts.
Like where?
Well, for starters, the Soviets used T-34-85s in their invasion of Manchuria against Japan in 1945.
Okay.
And then there was the Korean War. The Chinese used T-34-85s there.
Mm-hmm.
And U.S. intelligence reports from that war, they were actually impressed with the T-34's armor penetration capabilities.
Wow.
Then you had the Angolan Civil War.
Yeah.
The Cuban-backed FPLA forces used them extensively.
And the Yugoslav wars.
Yeah, all sides used them there. And it was also a major player in the Arab-Israeli wars.
Like the Suez Crisis in 1956, the Six-Day War in 1967, and the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
Exactly.
So it was being used by both sides in these conflicts.
Yeah, both the Arabs and the Israelis used them. Egypt even developed their own versions.
Like what?
The T-34-100 and the T-34-122, they put bigger guns on the T-34 chassis.
Interesting. What other conflicts did it see action in?
Let's see, the Soviet-Afghan War, the Vietnam War,
Wow.
conflicts in Yemen, including the Houthi insurgency as recently as 2015.
Recent.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces used them in the Bay of Pigs invasion
Okay.
and in Angola.
Yeah.
And the Cypriot National Guard used them in 1974.
During the coup and the Turkish invasion.
Yeah. And then you have SWAPO in Namibia, both sides in the Ethiopian-Somali War, and various militias in the Lebanese Civil War.
That's an incredible list. It's amazing how widespread it was.
Yeah, it really is. It was used all over the world. And it wasn't just a frontline combat tank either. They also converted them for other roles.
Like what?
Recovery and evacuation vehicles.
Okay.
The Czechoslovakians had the VT-34.
Mm-hmm.
It had a powerful winch system. And that actually influenced the Polish CW-34 recovery vehicle.
Okay.
And the Poles also had the WPT-34, which was an armored evacuation tractor.
So they could tow damaged vehicles off the battlefield.
Yeah. And then Syria and Egypt, they converted T-34s into self-propelled guns.
By mounting heavier artillery pieces on them.
Yeah, like 122-millimeter howitzers and even 100-millimeter field guns.
Wow, so they were pretty versatile.
They were.
It seems like with such a long and widespread service history, the T-34 must hold a lot of symbolism and have a pretty significant legacy.
Oh, absolutely. It's become an iconic tank.
Yeah.
And it's still present in a lot of ways, even today.
I mean, we see it in those Russian Victory Day parades.
Yeah, the fact that it's the only tank they use in those parades,
Right.
it's definitely gotten some attention.
And some criticism, too, especially in the West.
Yeah, there's been some pushback. And then there was the bomb attack on the T-34 memorial in Chemnitz in Germany.
Right.
And the whole pink tank controversy in Prague.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex legacy.
Especially in Eastern Europe. But in Poland, for example, it's seen as a cultural icon.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of that's because of this popular TV series, Chidrej Pensirni Ipais.
Which translates to?
4 cankmen and a dog.
Oh, okay.
And there was even that incident during the protests in Hungary in 2006,
Yeah.
where some protesters took control of a T-34 from a memorial exhibit.
Wow.
So it's still a powerful symbol. And it was still in service in some countries pretty recently, too.
Yeah, I was surprised to learn that.
Yeah, as of 2018, some countries still listed T-34s in their active inventories.
Like who?
Cuba, Yemen, Congo, Vietnam, and even North Korea.
Wow.
It's hard to say exactly how many are still in service today.
Yeah.
But it's amazing to think that a tank designed in the 1930s could still be used in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's pretty much unheard of.
Yeah. It might be obsolete in terms of modern warfare in Europe,
Right.
but in other parts of the world, its reliability, simplicity, and firepower,
Yeah.
they were still enough.
So to wrap things up, what would you say are the most important things to remember about the T-34?
Well, it was a revolutionary design.
Yeah.
Its firepower, mobility, and sloped armor, they really changed the game.
Yeah.
And it had a huge impact on the Eastern Front, especially at the beginning of the war.
The Germans were completely unprepared for it,
Yeah, and then it evolved into the T-34-85.
with the bigger gun and the three-man turret.
Exactly.
And its mass production, that was a testament to Soviet industrial power.
It was.
And it was a major factor in their victory. And then, after the war, its widespread use and longevity.
Yeah, it was used all over the world.
It's really incredible. A tank designed in the 1930s, seeing action in the 21st century.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really makes you think about all the different factors that came together to make that happen.
It does. You know, the design, the production, the global conflicts. It's a fascinating story.
And we've only scratched the surface here.
Definitely.
There are so many more stories to tell about the T-34. But for now, I think we've given our listeners a good overview.
I agree.
And speaking of our listeners, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the T-34, we'd love for you to show your support for the All Sorts podcast. Head over to our YouTube channel and hit that like button.
And subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Yeah, we've got a whole library of deep dives on all sorts of topics. And you can also follow us on X, Instagram, and Threads.
We're always posting interesting stuff and engaging with our community.
So join us on this journey of exploration and discovery. We can't wait to share more fascinating stories with you. Thanks for listening.